Good evening, everyone, from the Gail Lemron Auditorium in the Captain Willie Miller Building, where for the first time tonight, the man the building is named after, Gail Lemron, is in our audience here. Thank you, sir. Welcome to the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series. As America gets ready to inaugurate its next president, we have a historic book to talk about tonight with a man who was broadcasting from our campus just moments ago, talking about a man who was not only an incredible military leader and genius, but a man who possessed amazing common sense. Tonight, it is our pleasure to present as the opening speaker in the spring series here at Embry-Riddle, the host of the Fox Report at 6, and the author of the book, 3 Days in January. Ladies and gentlemen, Fox News political anchor, Bret Baier.
Hey. Hey, thanks so much.
Have a seat
Over
right
here?
here.
Okay. How are you? I needed these folks at the show out there.
Yeah. Busy boy today. How do your arms feel?
Oh, my goodness. Started on Fox and Friends this morning and just finished on air here. By the way, the shot looked fantastic. The replica of the Wright brothers plane looked fantastic in the light, and hopefully we brought some attention to this great place.
On behalf of Dr. Holbrook, thank you for choosing our university to broadcast from tonight. Before we get to Eisenhower, got to ask you, the speech from last night, we watched your analysis immediately afterwards. I think you were right on, but you were also very kind, because I was looking at this thing and I was thinking, what is this, an Amway meeting? I mean, it was really bizarre.
Yeah.
Was this a victory lap?
You know, I think it was an effort to recast the last 8 years for President Obama. I think that he's had a number of different explanations about why the loss by Hillary Clinton and for his party. And this was an effort to look forward, I think, and part pep rally, part defense of his policies, but also part warnings for things yet to come. And there were some veiled, messages, I think, to President-elect Trump and his administration. But what I started when we first came back is, I was struck by, first of all, the emotion of it, and it is a beautiful family that the Obamas are and were in the White House. Those two girls raised in that White House, and no matter your ideology, I think you have to really credit them for agreeing to serve the country. And it's not easy. You think about all the things and the perks that come with flying on Air Force One and all kinds of people serving you in the White House. It's also isolating. And at times, the White House campus can feel like a jail, I think, to some. And so I think the first thing that you had to look at that speech was service and sacrifice and crediting the Obamas for doing it for the U.S.
Did you get a sense of relief by the Obama family that this is over? We can go back to being people, regular people.
Yeah, I do. I think President Obama is anxious to play a little bit more golf and get out and write a book and speak.
Is there room for more golf?
There might be. Hey, listen, Eisenhower fitted in. He fitted in. By the way, I never begrudge a president for playing golf because you got to be able to get out there on the links. I think he's going to be in Washington. His two children are still going to be in school in Washington. And I think he is going to probably be one of the more active post-presidents in his party, trying to rehabilitate Democrats going forward.
There are so many similarities. I read every word of this book, and I loved it. I was a Truman fan for a long time. Now I'm really an Eisenhower fan. And the things that hit me in this book was, here's a young Dwight Eisenhower. He's in high school, and he injures himself, and he almost faces having his leg cut off, amputated. And he's the one that says no. That was a remarkable story.
Yeah. His growing up he was born in Denison, Texas, but he grew up in Abilene, Kansas, in the heartland. And it was a small, very modest house, if you make your way, and you really should if you can, to Abilene, Kansas, the Presidential Library. It's a spectacular place. The boyhood home is there. It's a wonderful museum. He grew up, modest Kansas beginning, and you're right, he almost lost his leg after just a minor scrape became a disease that he had to fight off for weeks at a time. He went on to go to West Point and become one of the real strategic thinkers that caught everyone's eye in the military. Everybody who dealt with him thought this guy has the ability to deal with all of the egos that you have to deal with in the top of the military. He could deal with the Pattons, the MacArthurs, the Bradleys, the Montgomery from Great Britain, de Gaulle. He could deal with all of them, which is why FDR chose him for World War II and D-Day, the biggest, obviously most consequential moment of the war.
That's a very important part of this book, and I hope every one of you reads it. How he handles the egos of the Pattons and the Montgomerys, knowing that they're at each other's throats. Yet Eisenhower never becomes flustered. He utilizes them, including Patton, who had gotten himself in trouble a few times, to the best of their ability.
One of the things that Eisenhower had, and it goes back to his growing up, was a humility. He was a humble leader. And there's a great story after World War II. He's doing these parades around the country, including going back to Abilene, Kansas. Ticker tape parades and the big parades, and there's one in Kansas. And he's coming down, waving at everybody, and someone turns to his mother, Ida, and says, "Oh, you must be so proud of your son." And she says, "Which one?" They had 6 sons, and Eisenhower always pointed to that as, always grounding in growing up. I like to say my wife does that for me.
How is your family, by the way? You have a beautiful family.
Oh, thank you. Doing great. 9-year-old Paul and 6-year-old Daniel. Just did a little FaceTime with them before they went to bed. They're doing great. My wife Amy is the rock who enables me to come talk to you and holds down the home front.
When you talk about the generals and all these egos that he had to handle, that manner served him well later when he enters politics. He has to deal with Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. He'll drink with them, but he doesn't really trust them.
Yeah.
And that comes through in this book.
It was one of the messages in this farewell address that I was so struck by. You always hear about the military-industrial complex line, and we can talk about that in a bit, but what struck me was the call for bipartisanship. The call for rising above party and ideology and to get things that are common ground across the finish line. He did work with House Speaker Sam Rayburn and Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson. He came into office with, as President-elect Trump will have, both chambers of Congress in his own party as Republicans. But a year and a half later, it changed, and Democrats took control of both the Senate and the House. So he had to figure out how to deal with that, and he invited them over. He had drinks. He always talked to them. He said that leadership was getting something done, but getting the other guy to think that it was his idea. And he managed to do that. He had a temper, and he got mad at things. A quick story from the White House and the Oval Office. And by the way, so we, in researching this, found these nuggets, these oral histories that had never been tapped before. Eisenhower talking about his time in office that nobody had really even looked at or listened to in the library. We went to the Kennedy Library and found new things, and the Truman Library. So when you read this book in the narrative form, I was trying to breathe life like you're in the room, and that's what I was trying to go for. Okay, so the anger part. He has a short temper. His secretary, Ann Whitman, dealt with it directly, and he really liked golf, obviously, and he went out to the South Lawn and would swing a club in the South Lawn. But he was really angry about one thing: the squirrels. He hated the squirrels. They got in the way of his swing. And he'd come in with his cleats and he'd say, "Could we get rid of these squirrels, these blank, blank squirrels?" And Ann Whitman would say, "Mr. President, they have every right to be there, just as much right as you have to be there." So one night, Ann was not there, and he had the Secret Service round up all the squirrels on the White House property and take them to Rock Creek Park. And he used to have what's called an anger drawer. And if he was angry at somebody, he would write down on a piece of paper their name and then shove it in the drawer. And that was his way of venting.
A tremendous victory, D-Day. He plans it, right down to, and the weather was not favoring them. So we get through this, the war is over. Does he have much interaction with the Pacific Command? Do they ever exchange notes? Because MacArthur had a huge ego too. Does he ever interact with Ike?
He does, and in letters. One thing that a lot of people didn't know is that Eisenhower was MacArthur's speechwriter as a colonel. So he knew him well. And imagine that these generals with these huge egos, here's the guy that was working for them, scripting their words, who then becomes the strategic planner and thinker of the entire world effort. That had to be humbling in one sense. D-Day was such a strategic moment. He was really worried about it not working. We found a note that he hand wrote and put in his pocket the day before the D-Day operation that said, if this does not succeed, and it is a failure because of me, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, he dated it accidentally July 5th, not June. They did change the day because of the weather, and he was worried that it was not going to happen. They almost called the whole thing off. And that moment, as you all know from history, changed the world.
The things I didn't know until I read this book is a fabulous look at an individual who is consistently good in his thinking. They lose a 3-year-old child. I think it was it Dowd?
Yeah, early stages of Dowd, yeah.
Was terrible, and he comes back from that. We come out of the war. Harry Truman likes Eisenhower, doesn't know his political party.
Loves him.
According to, in your book, we learned that Truman basically says, look, if you run, I'm not running in 48. And Eisenhower says he wants no part of it. Is that when he goes to Columbia University?
It is. And so Truman tries to recruit him. He sees how powerful a personality he is. He sees the people coming out every city to welcome and congratulate Eisenhower on this World War II victory. And Truman says, I want you to run for president. I will step aside and be your vice president to steer you through this. That's how much he valued and appreciated Eisenhower as a figure. Eisenhower says no thanks, and soon thereafter gets recruited, as he's Columbia University, gets recruited hard for a Republican run. He decides that he's not ideological, but he wants the Republicans to have a big figure in that race in 1952. Truman gets livid and can't stand it. He turns 180 degrees and goes after Eisenhower, calls him kind of dumb. He says, he knows zero about governing. He knows as much about governing as a pig knows about Sunday. And he would be in the press all the time. And Eisenhower didn't like that at all.
So Truman starts it because this bad blood that exists between them, Truman is sensitive to that because it is a dynamic you'll see in the book that it just changes him. And Truman never gets over this for the rest of his life. I mean, when he goes to build his library, he leaves Ike off the list.
Yeah, it was icy. It was chilly.
The inaugural is the most chilly.
Amazing story. So Eisenhower wins. 1953, the inauguration, January 20th. It's a cold day. The tradition is that the first couple to be drives up and goes into the White House for coffee. The relationship was so chilly at that moment that the Eisenhowers stayed in the car. They never went into the White House. The Trumans stayed in the White House, and there was a standoff right in front of the South Portico there, and they were delayed. And finally, the Trumans come out, they get in the car, and both the Eisenhower Library and the Truman Library describe the ride from the White House to the Capitol as silent. Not a single word, crickets chirping. Imagine being the driver of that car. How you guys doing back there? All right? Everything good?
So doesn't this follow him? So Eisenhower's president, runs for re-election in 56. Truman at some point decides to show up, right? And Eisenhower wouldn't see him? Or is that what happened?
There was a back and forth whether Eisenhower didn't invite him or Truman said he didn't invite him. Eisenhower says he did invite him but never heard back. I mean, it was a real standoff. The Eisenhower people insist they invited him. They clear the air eventually, but it takes, unfortunately, the assassination of President Kennedy to bring these two former presidents together. And they do come together, and they end their time actually talking to each other.
1955, Eisenhower has a heart attack after playing golf and eating a humongous hamburger.
He was not the healthiest of our presidents, but he was transparent. He decided that he was going to have Jim Haggerty, his press secretary, put out every detail of his health after the heart attack, and every detail.
Too much.
And then he writes a letter to Jim, and he says, "Jim, we could do without the daily bowel movement updates."
Was he in the hospital for 2 months?
He was. And there was real doubt whether he was going to run again. And there was a decision that he asked Mamie, his wife, whether he should. And she said, "This is your decision, but I stand with you. I don't want to be on the other side of you regretting or doing it and then you dying." And he makes the decision to run, and the doctors give him a clean bill of health, and he runs. Let me, if I could, go back to tell you why I did this.
Yes.
Can I take one of those books?
Absolutely.
So I'm a golfer, and I played golf in college at DePaul University in Indiana. And I got the holy grail of golf invites to Augusta National. And I was on cloud 9. I mean, it was coming out of my shoes. So I drive down Magnolia Lane there in Augusta, and I can hear the CBS music, you know, da, da, da. You know, it's just a moment. And I get there to the front, and I meet the member who's taking me, and they say, "Mr. Baier, you'll be staying in the Eisenhower cabin tonight." And you know, I get goosebumps when I talk about it. And I go, and Eisenhower cabin, which you may have seen pictures of, it's not really a cabin, it's sort of like a White House. I mean, it's a small White House. It is where Eisenhower spent his time. You know, Bush had his ranch in Crawford, you had Reagan with his ranch out in California. This was Eisenhower's escape. It's right by the 10th tee at Augusta, and it overlooks the par 3 course in the back. It's just serene, gorgeous. So I walk in there, and I'm all jacked up, and I'm ready for the round the next day, and I can't go to bed. And I pour myself a glass of wine, or maybe 2, and I walk around the Eisenhower cabin. And I was just really struck by all the memorabilia and all the things on the wall and the writings and the statues and the Secret Service quarters that's in the basement. And it's still in like a 50s kind of look to it, style. And I suddenly realized that while I knew a lot about General Eisenhower and the war, I didn't really know about President Eisenhower, and I cover politics. And I thought, if I don't know, imagine what my generation or younger knows or doesn't know about Eisenhower. So I vowed, after I was going to play that round, that I was going to go to the Eisenhower Library, which I did. And I went to Abilene, Kansas, talked to the people there, and they said, you know, one thing that hasn't been really explored is this transition from Eisenhower to Kennedy and the farewell address. So at that moment, they take me to the library. This woman comes out with a cardboard box. I put on white gloves. She pulls out of this box this plastic, and out of the plastic comes the farewell address that Eisenhower delivers, with all of the markings and the scribbles and the edits and the underlines and the capitalizing. And there's the writing of the 34th President of the United States. And I thought, this is spectacular. This is what America needs. This is what kids need. They need to know. So the dedication, thank you. So the dedication of the book says, to our sons, Paul and Daniel, and their generation. please allow history to inform your decisions in the future. And that's what started it. And 3.5 years later of research and working and a great team, I'm really proud of this book.
You should be. When I was 9 years old, I wrote to Dwight Eisenhower and I got an answer.
Did you really?
He was 74 years old, and he actually wrote the thing himself. Herbert Hoover was like 90 at that time. Hoover didn't really like Eisenhower, did he? Why?
Well, I mean, I think it was the standoff, the egos, the sense that Eisenhower was working a lot with the other side and having success. And I think there was an animosity there.
It's interesting that in the military-industrial complex, the original phrase was military-industrial academic complex. He deleted academic on second thought, and he left it to Senator William Fulbright to deal with that about a decade later. Fulbright actually criticized that a university fails its higher purpose by lending itself too much to the purposes of government. I wonder what the rationale was. I wonder what Eisenhower was thinking and Fulbright. What did they see coming?
Well, it was actually more complex than that. He had the academic, he also had scientific in there, and he had congressional. So it was military, industrial, academic, scientific, congressional complex. Well, that was too complex. And he thought congressional might be a little forward-leaning for lawmakers on Capitol Hill. But his ultimate thought process, what made him mad, was at the time he was seeing in magazines companies that were advertising for missiles. These are in Home Ec magazines,
Life magazine,
or Life magazine, or People magazine. And every time he saw one, he got livid. And he believed that there was this cycle that was forming, that lobbyists would put money into lawmakers. Lawmakers would then affect policy. Then some of them would get to positions of policy decision-making and leave government and go lead a company that was trying to get the very thing that they were in charge of doing. I mean, it was prescient. It was a whistleblower moment for this president. As far as the academic, I think he feared that that was being tapped into by these same companies that turned their companies around to help in the war effort, but now we're almost in a self-fulfilling cycle. We're dealing with that today. I mean, we still deal with that issue. You could read this speech today. President Obama, instead of doing the walkout and the whole thing, he could have done this speech and still been relevant to our issues.
Help us understand why things were so weak between he and Nixon. Nixon was a senator. He's a loyal, he reminds me of Biden from the standpoint, very loyal to Eisenhower, from what I read, a very good vice president. But Eisenhower always held him at a distance. I don't think he even invited him to some of these Sam Rayburn, Lyndon Johnson little get-togethers they had. And Nixon was hurt by that.
He was, and scorned almost. Well, it started at the beginning where Eisenhower he had a great respect for Nixon on foreign policy, thought that he had a great mind for foreign policy, thought and wrote that he thought he was a little bit overly political. And he gets into trouble, Nixon does, with a little dust up, and you may remember the Checkers speech where he apologizes at the beginning of this campaign. He then is always suspicious about Nixon and his motives and what he's doing behind the scenes. He knows he wants to run for president eventually. When he finally gets to the point where he's going to run for president, Eisenhower calls him in before they run for re-election and says, Dick, I know you want to run for this office. You may want to own an issue, own something that we're doing positively, and run as a cabinet secretary and own something specific that you can then run for president off of. And Nixon is really afraid that he's trying to kick him off the ticket and that it is a negative thing. And he's always then at odds with Eisenhower. Eisenhower says that's not the purpose, that's not what he did, and he stayed on as vice president. Nixon, when he runs, keeps Eisenhower off the trail. And he largely does not campaign for Nixon at Nixon's request because he wanted to be his own man, not in Eisenhower's shadow. If Dick Nixon had had Eisenhower on the trail, Eisenhower was at 62% approval at that point. When he finally put him out on the trail at the end of the 1960 campaign, Eisenhower gets huge crowds. But at that point, the signs say, "I like Ike, but I'm voting for Jack." Kennedy is heard saying, you know, every day that Eisenhower is on the campaign trail, I feel like I'm on a mound of sand and a wave is coming in every day and I'm sinking and sinking and sinking. And the Kennedy people believed if Eisenhower campaigned for another week that they would have lost that election.
I found it interesting to read in your book that the famous TV debate where Nixon looks bad and does poorly, there's a debate, if I'm not mistaken, it is so bad that the Kennedys actually think of calling. Somebody was going to call and apologize. Or
Rose Kennedy.
Rose Kennedy was going to call. His mother to say, "I'm so sorry, my condolences." Yeah.
Because it was so bad. And Eisenhower he didn't want him to debate at all. You know, before that, there weren't these debates. In fact, believe it or not, they had people stand in
substitute debate.
Substitute debate. You know, like in the place of President Eisenhower, and then they're going to debate someone else, not the actual people. The other reason I chose this, by the way, is that Eisenhower is the first television president. He is the first president who puts press conferences on the record. Before that, believe it or not, the White House press secretary press corps could go in and to a news conference with the president. They could ask questions, but they could never directly quote the president of the United States. So that the president always had plausible deniability. "Oh, I didn't say it like that. It wasn't that way. Misinterpreted." So there were no quotes from the president even after a news conference. So Eisenhower says, "Well, that's ridiculous. Put the transcript out." Well, the reporters ate that up because, you know, the transcript is kind of halting and stopping and starting. He says things the wrong way, and they write that he's a fumbling, bumbling kind of speaker. And that's where that narrative comes from. Secondly, he says, you know what, just let him record for TV and for radio the news conferences with me. And then he has the first television broadcast live of a presidential news conference. Dwight D. Eisenhower, black and white, and he was the first guy who opened up the press. So for a guy who was the chief White House correspondent, that was a big moment and one of the reasons I chose him.
He does his farewell address on TV from the White House, from the Oval Office, just days before Kennedy is being sworn in.
3 days.
3 days. So from what we gather in this book, he doesn't really like Kennedy, but he respects the office, correct? And that's why he gives him the time. That's why when Kennedy gets into the mess with the Bay of Pigs, he has Eisenhower come back, and that's that beautiful picture right on the front at Camp David that used to be called, I didn't know it until Bret wrote it, Shangri-La. Can you imagine? The president will be at his retreat at Shangri-La this weekend. Who came up with that idea?
You know, it was before, FDR came up with the idea, and then he renamed it, Eisenhower did, for his son and grandson. Really, he named it after his grandson. This book starts with President-elect Kennedy arriving at the White House to meet with President Eisenhower. It ends with President-elect Trump meeting President Obama at the White House. And those are the bookends there of this, the beginning and end. When Kennedy comes, you're right, there is he's skeptical of Kennedy. He watched him on the campaign trail. He said some things that really got under Ike's skin. Number one was the U.S. missile gap that Kennedy kept on hitting. He kept on saying that the Soviets were churning out missiles faster than the U.S. was. Well, Eisenhower knew that not to be true, and he had his intelligence people brief President-elect Kennedy, or candidate Kennedy, and yet he still used it. So it really made him mad. 2, he thought that he was just hollow, and that this matinee idol kind of image there wasn't that much there. They meet in the Oval Office, and Eisenhower is actually really impressed with Kennedy. His breadth of knowledge, his ability to articulate different national security issues, and he thinks to himself and writes, maybe the American people got it right. They saw something I didn't see. But he has concerns that Kennedy is a little bit cocky when it comes to the national security apparatus and what Eisenhower has set up in dissenting views to hear and argue big issues in front of him to make sure all sides are argued. Kennedy thinks of it as you could do this with a couple of advisors, which he ends up doing. He ends up dismantling what Eisenhower put in place, and then the Bay of Pigs happens. And Kennedy calls it a disaster. And that is the first person he calls is former President Eisenhower, who he flies to Camp David. And this picture is the 2 men walking on a path at Camp David. And Kennedy turns to Eisenhower and says, you know, no one really knows how tough this is until you're in the office. And Eisenhower says, Mr. President, with all due respect, I think I told you this 3 months ago.
Yeah. Can I ask you about a sidebar?
Yeah.
Because this book is rich in stories, things I never knew. A little bit of friction between Mamie and Jackie.
Yeah.
A couple of things. Like on the way to the inaugural, Mamie makes a comment that sounds like an Irish slur, I think.
Paddy wagon.
Yeah. And then when she gets a tour of the White House, I think she's giving a tour to Jackie, who had just come out of the hospital, I think. They lost their child.
Right.
Mamie doesn't know whether to give her a wheelchair or what. And then there's this thing where Jackie is reportedly crying because she felt she was mistreated by Mamie, but she makes this comment saying this is like a gulag in Russia.
Because she didn't like the decor. I mean, the decorating was way beneath, where the Kennedys were, and she talked about it. So there was a little animosity. Mamie never took it too seriously, but the Eisenhowers obviously didn't have the same level taste when it came to design from Abilene, Kansas. It was pretty Spartan. And Jackie Kennedy initiates a major redesign of the White House and redesigns all the rooms. In fact, the room in which President-elect Trump and President Obama meet, the diplomatic room in the bottom of the White House, is redesigned by Jackie Kennedy in 1962.
I'm trying to go through this story. We're going to take questions from the audience before Bret signs the book, so think of your question. We'll take a few, and we'll have our microphones set up. I got to go back to Truman because the Trumans will take a train to Missouri, but Dwight Eisenhower at the end is thinking, you know what, let's fly him home. So he sends a message to Truman saying, we'll fly you to Missouri. Truman doesn't answer?
He doesn't answer. This was before their détente, obviously, and he says, no thanks.
Wow. They drive themselves, don't they?
They do. And, the Secret Service in those days, it was gone. Like, you're out, we'll see you later. Best of luck. And it's not like that, obviously, now. The other thing that's striking about Eisenhower's presidency is all that happened. He gets us out of the war in Korea. He passes this massive national highway bill that sets up the highway system that we now ride on, which, by the way, is going to be a bill very soon in the new administration on infrastructure that will need bipartisan support. Eisenhower got overwhelmingly bipartisan support for a bill that was stalled in Congress. He passes the first civil rights legislation since the Reconstruction. Nobody really credits Eisenhower with doing that, but he led the way on the issue of civil rights legislation. He has a booming economy. He keeps us out of war. In fact, not a single soldier dies in combat in the 8 years under President Eisenhower's 2 terms. He installs the national motto, "In God We Trust," is because of Eisenhower on the money. "Under God" is added to the Pledge of Allegiance because of Eisenhower. And he has this leadership style that he lets other people take credit. Fred Goldstein, the political scientist, called it the hidden hand. The ability to hold your cards close to your vest, let people have dissenting views, but then lift people up, and that's what his leadership style was all about. If you don't mind, I'll read something that I found that I didn't put in the book. I have a special coming out this Sunday, an hour special called 3 Days in January. It'll be on Fox at 8 p.m. Eastern and 11 p.m. Eastern. And we spent about 6 months interviewing a bunch of people around the country who were a part of the Eisenhower administration, historians, and it tracks roughly the book. But there are some people in here that I interviewed that I didn't put everything in the book. One of them is Bob Kiev. He was a speechwriter, and he gets to Eisenhower, the editor, who was an amazing editor of words, but he didn't speak that fluently, extemporaneously, but he edited speeches amazingly. Now, in those days, they had to redo the drafts. So the draft would come in, he would edit it up, circle, cross things out, and they'd send it back out, and Ann Whitman, the secretary who I talked to you about, had to retype them. Well, Ann Whitman sent a letter to Bob and said, "You need to help me out here." Because she kept on retyping and retyping and retyping, and he kept on editing and editing and editing, and she was getting sick of doing it. Give me 1 second here. So she sends a letter to Bob that says this. First, do not use the word merit as a verb. Use it as a noun. Second, never use the pronoun I at the beginning of 2 consecutive paragraphs. Please, Bob. Third, this morning, this note says, a mild grumble from the boss on your using 2 adjectives. Warm best wishes. Bob, you can make the wishes warm. You can make them best. You just can't make them warm best. Fourth, never take it for granted that the president knows something about a national or local organization. Say, I'm happy to learn, or I understand that. Fifth, not only but also, it's fine, Bob, in its place, but please, Bob, not in every message. Sixth, one day, she says, look, Bob, every time you use the word appreciation, you follow it with the word for. Haven't you noticed that President Eisenhower consistently changes that to appreciation of? So please, Bob, for my sake, for God's sake, when you use the word appreciation, never follow it with the word for. Always follow it with the word of. Well, Bob changed his whole thing. He didn't do any of these things. He leaves the White House. He gets this signed picture from Eisenhower, and it says, to Bob Kiev, with best warm wishes, and with lasting appreciation of, underlined, valuable service in the White House. Thank you very much, Dwight D. Eisenhower. But that's indicative of the kind of nuggets and just stuff that you can find at a library that's within our grasp. You just have to dig for it.
Eisenhower could really write. William Randolph Hearst tried to get him to quit the Army, was going to give him what, triple his salary?
Yes.
And he said no?
He said no.
Wow.
He was driven, he was driven. But he was, as I mentioned, he was humble. He told Mamie that he didn't think he could make colonel.
Wow.
This is the guy that won World War II. So the other thing is that when he leaves office, he's anxious to be a civilian again. He writes a letter to his friends and says, you used to call me Ike. As of this day, you will call me Ike this day forward. He wanted to die as a military man, so he had Kennedy, calls Kennedy up, says, please draft a bill and have Congress pass a bill reinstating me as a 5-star general. And Kennedy says, why would you want that? President outranks general. And he says, I want to die as a military man. Congress passes it. Kennedy signs it. He becomes General Eisenhower again, and they bury him in his uniform.
He wanted to get right back into life as quickly as possible, but he hadn't made a purchase at a store in years. He didn't have a set of keys. He wanted to take the car, and they go, "Don't do this." Why? You can't drive. I mean, it was so bad. Weren't they moving cars so he wouldn't hit people's cars?
In Gettysburg, they would say, the president is leaving, and then the restaurant would clear out the parking lot because he kept on hitting cars when he went to park. He couldn't get an outside line on his phone.
Oh, that's funny.
He said, could somebody please help me? And they said, just push the button right there. And so, yeah, he had a hard time getting back into life. But he wrote a lot, and he had a diary. He did oral histories. And there is a new book out, believe it or not, that shows that he wrote a lot to Ronald Reagan and really steered Reagan's early political thought process. So I commend that to you. I have not read it yet, but the author just reached out to me the other day. And who knows? It might be 3 days in October next in Reagan or something. We'll figure it out.
When Kennedy dies, the assassination, the whole nation is struck by this. Johnson comes in, and Johnson starts talking to Eisenhower. And if I'm not mistaken, doesn't Ike advise him on how to handle Vietnam? But it still gets messed up.
Yeah, he does some conversations about Vietnam. He suggests that if you're going to do it overwhelmingly, which is what was in the farewell address. Try not to get involved overseas, but if you do, win it. And that is some of the advice that he gives Johnson. You're right. The assassination affects Ike deeply. He, at the end, was talking to Kennedy quite a bit and felt that he had reestablished this relationship, and it changes the nation, but obviously brings two former presidents together in Eisenhower and Truman.
Eisenhower lives long enough to see Nixon elected because he dies in '69, Nixon wins in '68. Does Nixon turn for that election? Does he look to Ike? Have things gotten better between him and Ike?
They have, and he advises him, he talks to him, he uses him on the campaign trail. I think Ike shows up someplace in the Nixon campaign, but largely he is, in private life now. He's doing painting, and he's playing a lot of golf at Augusta National.
It's an incredible
That was his wonderful place. You remember the Eisenhower tree? Obviously, that was on 17. It unfortunately was hit by an ice storm not too long ago, and it was taken down. Eisenhower would have loved that moment because he wanted that tree removed from the beginning. He kept on hitting it. He had a little draw, and he could never get over that tree. And he said, that damn tree. And the club never would remove it. Now they have a slice of the trunk of the Eisenhower tree at the Eisenhower Library, and one at Augusta National. So Ike is looking down, smiling, because he could probably hook it a lot better on 17 now than he ever could.
We're going to ask that we set up our microphones. If you have a question for Bret, we'll take a few questions relating to this story, and then Bret will sign copies of the book. Our partners from the bookstore are still selling copies of this book, which is fantastic. So if you come down, we'll go left to right. One last question on this, and then we'll come to the audience. So if you'll come down right now, we'll take a few of your questions. What is the thing about Eisenhower's ability as a general that impresses you the most? Is it his measure? Is it his ability to employ the best of other people?
Yeah, I think it was empowering others to be the best that they could be, number one. Number two was the strategic thinking, like thinking one step ahead. He always had this ability to hear all of the voices in the room and to make sure that he heard every possible thing that could happen. What happened was he would hear that, but then he would make a decision. So he wasn't paralyzed by the dissenting views. He was energized by it. And that's really what made him a great general and also a great president.
And finally, do you think that there will be a relationship between President Obama and Donald Trump once he is inaugurated, that he will look to him, that they will talk together, or do you think that's too much to expect?
No, I actually think they will. That first meeting is We had some behind-the-scenes background information that it really went well, better than either person thought that would go. And since then, they've talked a lot. There's been, public tweets and comments that looked like it was icy for a bit. But largely the transition from both sides logistically is going very well, and they talk a lot more than they talk about in the press. I think you're going to see, if Ike was alive, he'd probably say, and then somebody asked him about Donald Trump and Twitter, he might say, well, first he'd say, what's Twitter? And then he'd say, don't do it. Less is more. Less is more. And who knows what's going to happen when Donald Trump gets into the Oval Office. But the power of that office and every word matters. He's different. And Ike was a non-politician, Trump, a non-politician. You couldn't pin down Ike on ideology. Some people thought he was a Democrat, some people thought he was Republican. Trump, conservatives thought he was too liberal at the beginning. Liberals thought he was alt-right conservative. And while he's a businessman, Ike had a cabinet that was 8 millionaires and a plumber, is what they called it, because he had businessmen and the head of the Plumbing Association, who was the labor secretary. His Secretary of Defense was the CEO of GM. And so they had the same issues of untangling businesses to get into government. So there's a lot of similarities, but obviously a lot of contrasts.
Let's go to questions. Your question first, right into the microphone tonight for Bret Baier.
During President Eisenhower's farewell speech, he talks about this great sense of balance and things that he wants most with the, private sector, public sector, everything being balanced. What type of balance are you seeing with the new administration?
With the incoming administration? Well, I think we have yet to see. I think that there will be things that happen very quickly. When Donald Trump takes office, there's going to be a flurry of executive orders that change the direction of regulations. And Capitol Hill, I just talked with House Speaker Paul Ryan the other day, and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. They are poised to move very fast on a number of big things. So the balance that they see is to get balance back for small business and the onus that they feel has been on them from the past administration. I think we don't know how Donald Trump will handle crisis, and that's the question. I think Ike would give the same advice that he was giving Kennedy.
To this side, your question, please.
When it comes to transition of conflict, Eisenhower dealt with the Cold War, Cuba, Korea, and China. And then Kennedy had the responsibility to deal with all those conflicts. Do you see the common reality between radical Islamic terrorism affecting the world enemy, as the Russians were in the 50s, from Obama shifting all that conflict to Trump? Would you possibly see any major common grounds between how Kennedy might deal with it in his short time to how Trump might deal with it?
Yeah, I think there's a direct correlation. I think that this speech, like I said, has relevance today, and his life has relevance today because of the messages and the warnings he was delivering. If you take out communism and the atheistic threat part of the speech, but global in scale, clearly radical Islam is that. And if you insert that into this speech, it could be that. I think there's a lot of similarities. The world hotspots are hotter now. And that is why, Trump will need really great voices in his administration. Jim Mattis has amazing experience. General, well-respected both sides of the aisle. He shouldn't have any problem in confirmation. Rex Tillerson today, had some dust-ups, but they're not expecting any problems. They have the votes. I think there's a direct correlation.
Over here, your question.
First, I want to thank you for coming out to Embry-Riddle. I appreciate it very much.
And by the way, I was a Sigma Chi at DePaul University.
We know.
Oh, okay.
Most of us are.
In hope.
So we wanted to ask, do you think you were involved in any leadership organizations in college that helped you push your career as successful as you are today? And if so, what would you recommend to us college students that we participate in university to help us become successful in our careers?
Well, listen, I think just getting involved is great. I actually, not to toot your horn, but I thought the fraternity system where I was a great leadership thing. I was in leadership in the house at DePaul. By the way, Steve Hayes, who's on my panel, he also went to DePaul University and also was a Sigma Chi. And I did not Hayes. I just want that out there. But he does have a lot of stories about me, which is why he's on the panel. But anyway, I think get involved, do something. When you think you don't know how you're going to get from point A to point B, I say keep driving. I've given some speeches to high school graduations and other graduations, and I say it's like a car, and you have dim headlights, but you're on the road. And then you have your high beams start to kick in, and you see a little bit more of the road. And then eventually the sun comes up, and you see the hill, and you see a lot of the road. And before you know it, you're there. But you always keep driving on the road. So even though you can't see how you get from point A to point B, you just keep going. And that's what I always did. I did small market TV. I bounced around the country in some really amazing markets. Rockford, Illinois is, it's pretty small. I was there 11 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Loved Rockford. Raleigh, North Carolina, Savannah, Georgia. So I didn't know how I was going to get there, but I knew I had this love for politics, love for covering government, and eventually I did. So I'm blessed to be where I am.
And if I may.
Yes, sir.
Hey,
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We'll take 3 more questions, then Bret signs. Over here, you're next with Bret Baier. Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, how are you?
Hey.
First of all, like the gentleman before me said, thank you so much for coming. It's a fantastic experience. My question for you is, you said that you wanted to breathe life into the story.
Yeah.
To me, that's the best thing about history is those little anecdotal stories. Obviously, we're living history right now every day, but especially with this current election, what do you think, for you especially being so involved with politics, for you, what was probably the most interesting story of this most recent election?
Wow.
A lot of material to work with.
We'll be back in a week.
How much time do you have?
Wow.
Listen, it was unbelievable if you think about this election.
How about 17 people on stage?
Our first debate in Cleveland in August, first debate, 17 people. We had 2 stages. And, obviously that debate caused a lot of news to come out of that debate. The third debate, I'm moderating in Detroit, and I ask a question about civility. Suddenly it gets to the size of hands and comparison to the size of genitals. And I turn to Chris Wallace and I say, okay, moving on. That's a surreal moment. I kept a diary. There were amazing things that happened on the trail. But I think the most amazing was election night and seeing that the exit polls didn't match the polls in these states. And then at whatever time it was, 2:30 in the morning, to say that President-elect Donald Trump, for me to announce that was a big moment for me in my career. And I think it was a big moment for the country where you realized we missed it. We missed a lot. And I think that'll be the ever-told story of this election.
Right over here, your question for Bret Baier.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I'd like to thank you for coming over.
Thank you.
Like I said, warm welcome from Texas. This university is one of aviators, scholars, and I'm very proud to be part of it.
Excellent.
But above all else, a lot of it, there's a very strong military presence here. And I would have to say in this room that there's many people who are in ROTC and, of course, going to become future officers. And I think it's a very pertinent question to ask, what do you think the direction of the military will be in according to Donald Trump And how can maybe we tie that back into Ike's service?
Yeah, that's great. Well, first of all, thanks for your service or service to be.
Don't thank me.
You know, I spent 6.5 years covering the Pentagon, and I traveled around the world with the U.S. military. I've been to 74 countries, covering and reporting from different places, on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq a couple dozen times, and was embedded with special forces along the Afghan-Pakistan border to be able to report on some of that stuff. And let me just, as an aside, before I answer your President-elect Trump question, what that did for me was to show me the service and sacrifice of not only the men and women, but their families back home. Just one quick anecdote. I was in the mountains of Afghanistan. We had been out for 2 days. There was a lot of heavy fighting, as there were the early days of fighting the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda going between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Finally made it back to the forward operating base, and it was the early days of Skype. And I was filing my story on the computer, and next to me was a soldier who had just come back in. And on the computer, he was meeting his son for the first time. His wife had a baby. So she's crying on the computer, he's crying at the computer, I'm typing my story crying, and I suddenly, you know, you have an appreciation. I think Donald Trump has that appreciation. He talks a lot about respecting the military, changing the VA, increasing the military. But I think he also has, like Ike did, a sense of not getting involved everywhere. So I think, you know, with advice like General Mattis and others that he has, General Flynn, that it'll be a different sense in the military and perhaps a different direction that people on the ground feel a little bit better about.
2 final questions over here.
Hello, Mr. Baier. Thank you for coming. So you mentioned that Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Right into the mic, if you could.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
He was a
it out.
very he was a very humble leader. With Donald Trump coming in, the billionaire has a very big ego.
That would be one of the contrasts.
Yes. So based on all the contrasts, do you see any similarities between their policy going forward, or how they just plan on basically handling the country?
Yeah. So, you know, Eisenhower had this hidden hand. Trump has the out front hand. You know, I mean, there's sometimes that I think that he tweets these things just to keep us in the media engaged at the shiny thing. You know, like Arnold Schwarzenegger's ratings on Apprentice. I mean, everybody talks about it all through the morning news, but really what's happening behind the scenes. So it's definitely a different communication strategy. But I do think that the bipartisan side of Eisenhower, there is potential there. And I know for a fact he has been talking to Democratic leaders on the Hill. And despite the fact that he tweeted out that Chuck Schumer is head clown, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I do think that that also was about firing up both sides' bases. And I'm going to call you head clown. I'm going to tweet this out, and you're going to fire up your base, and I'm going to fire up my base. We're going to get to inauguration, and we're going to get some stuff done. That's what I hear behind the scenes. Now, we'll see if that really happens. But the media is like a giant bass. We're like, you know. We just take the hook every time.
I got one more question before we go to signing. It's been a long day for Mr. Baier. Hello.
I just want to say I'm a big fan.
Thank you.
My question is, do you see Mr. Trump going for just 1 term or 2?
Good question.
That's a great question. I think it obviously depends on how he does, what he gets done, and how the American people deal with this new, this unknown figure, that how he's going to deal with the Oval Office. I know that there are a lot of knives out there already within his own party, and people who are anxious to run and maybe even primary him. But if he's successful early on, he's going to have a lot of breathing room and a decision to make. I just wonder whether he's going to the White House is going to be big enough for him.
Hey, will he be at the Ted Cruz birthday party?
He might be. He might be. They've mended ways.
We want to thank some people who helped make tonight possible. My colleagues here at Embry-Riddle, Jen Lescraft, James Scott, Kathleen Hennessy, to Chivalry Wu, who's our photographer, Bob Score, who's caught every one of these since we began, Bob Davidson upstairs with his crew, Tony Marks, who sets up our set all the time. We want to tell you about what's coming up when we come back in just a few days. Next Tuesday, we return to celebrate Embry-Riddle athletics, a celebration of excellence with these two guys, the well-tanned Steve Ritter and the slightly whiter John Phillips. I hope you'll join us because we're going to have all the stars of athletics from Embry-Riddle here. It's a real celebration, and it's a very special night. It'll be a little bit different in our format, but then we come back January 30th. We'll talk about the end of the Apollo program with a professor from the University of Tennessee who wrote about that and is writing about a new book about the space program. So I want to get Bret over to the table to sign copies of his book. Our partners are going to be selling the books, and you can make your way. We ask you to be brief because it's been a long day. Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Bret Baier.
Thanks very much.